It started on a rainy night. Jenna, a college student with a passion for photography, came across an old camera at a flea market. The camera was a vintage model with a distinctive brass finish and a peculiar aura. The vendor, an elderly man with a cryptic smile, sold it to her for a bargain price. He whispered, "This camera captures more than just images." Jenna brushed off the remark as eccentricity. She was excited to test the camera and see what kind of pictures it could take. The next day, Jenna decided to take a walk in the nearby park, camera in hand. She snapped pictures of the serene landscape, capturing the vibrant autumn leaves and the soft sunlight filtering through the trees. The photos turned out beautifully. But as she developed the film, Jenna noticed something strange. In the background of several pictures, there were shadowy figures that weren't visible when she took the shots. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light or an error in developing, but the figures seemed too distinct to ignore. She brushed it off as a glitch and decided to take more photos, intrigued by the oddity. Jenna began using the camera obsessively, photographing everything from her daily life to her friends and family. Each roll of film revealed more unsettling images. People with ghostly faces, strange entities lurking in corners, and dark shapes that seemed to shift as she reviewed them. Despite her growing unease, Jenna couldn't stop using the camera. One evening, she took a photo of her roommate Lisa, who was sitting in the living room, reading a book. When Jenna developed the photo, Lisa's face was replaced by a distorted, horror-stricken expression, her eyes wide with terror. Jenna showed the photo to Lisa, who was shocked but dismissed it as a bad photo. As Jenna continued using the camera, the haunting presence in the photos grew more pronounced. The shadows and figures became more defined and malevolent. Jenna started seeing these apparitions in her daily life, out of the corner of her eye or in reflections. Her dreams were plagued with disturbing visions of the figures from her photos. Her friends noticed her growing paranoia and urged her to stop using the camera. But Jenna, now obsessed, refused to listen. Camera became her constant companion, and she began to fear what might happen if she stopped using it. One night, Jenna was alone in her apartment, reviewing the latest set of photos. She found one that was particularly chilling, a photo of her own bedroom. The image was distorted and filled with dark, writhing shadows. Among the shadows, she could make out her own figure, lying in bed, looking exactly like she did at that moment. Terrified, Jenna decided she had to confront whatever was causing this. She took the camera and set up a makeshift studio in her bedroom. She aimed the camera at herself, intending to capture whatever it was that haunted her. She set the timer and posed, trying to appear calm despite her fear. When the flash went off, Jenna felt an icy chill envelop her. The room seemed to warp and twist as if reality itself was being manipulated. She developed the final roll of film with trembling hands. The last photo was a stark and horrifying revelation. It showed Jenna standing in her bedroom, but her reflection in the mirror was not her own. Instead, it was a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure with a menacing grin. In the photo, the figure's hand was reaching out from the mirror, grasping towards the camera. Jenna's heart raced as she realized the figure was not just a reflection, but an entity trying to break through. Jenna's phone rang. It was a message from an unknown number. The message contained only one photo, her own bedroom with the camera in the middle, pointing straight at her, and her own terrified face visible in the camera's viewfinder. Below the photo was a chilling caption, "You were always meant to be the final shot." Panic-stricken, Jenna turned around to find the room eerily quiet and still. The camera was now lying on the floor, and the lens was cracked. She picked it up and looked at it for one last time. The camera emitted a low, eerie hum, and a faint whisper echoed through the room. The cycle continues. Desperate, Jenna tried to leave the apartment, but the door wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows from the photos now manifested into tangible, creeping darkness. Jenna realized with a cold shiver that the camera had claimed her, and there was no escape. The next morning, the apartment was found empty. Jenna was gone, leaving only the camera behind. Her friends and family were bewildered by her disappearance and the strange messages and photos left behind. The Silent Guest. It was a cold November night when Jonathan first noticed something strange. He lived alone in a small rural house at the edge of town, a quiet, isolated place that suited him just fine. The neighbors were distant, the nights were silent, and the woods behind his house were thick and dark. It was a place where one could easily lose themselves. That night, as he prepared for bed, Jonathan heard a knock at the door. This was unusual. No one ever visited him, especially not at that hour. Hesitant but curious, he went to answer it. To his surprise, no one was there. He stepped outside, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing except the stillness of the night. Shrugging it off as a prank, Jonathan returned inside. But just as he was about to close the door, he noticed something on the porch. A small wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, with no markings or labels. There was no note, no sign of where it had come from. Against his better judgment, Jonathan picked up the box and brought it inside. The box was surprisingly heavy for its size, and it was sealed tightly. Jonathan set it on the kitchen table and examined it closely. The wood was old, worn smooth by time, and the edges were nailed shut. There was something unsettling about it, something that made Jonathan hesitate before trying to open it. After a moment's deliberation, he decided to pry it open. Using a small knife, he carefully worked at the seams until the lid popped off with a faint creak. Inside was an old, weathered photograph of a man standing in front of what appeared to be Jonathan's house, though it looked much older in the picture. The man had a stern, expressionless face, and his eyes seemed to bore into Jonathan even through the photograph. Beneath the photo was a small, handwritten note. He never left. Jonathan's skin prickled with unease. He didn't recognize the man in the photo, and there was no explanation for the note. It felt like a warning, and whom, and why? The more he stared at the photo, the more uneasy he became. The man's face seemed to change subtly the longer he looked at it, his eyes growing darker, his expression more menacing. Jonathan decided to put the box away and go to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. His mind kept returning to the photograph, and the strange feeling that he wasn't alone. Over the next few days, Jonathan began to notice strange occurrences in the house. Objects were not where he had left them, doors that were closed were found open, and at night he could hear faint footsteps echoing through the hallways. He tried to convince himself that it was his imagination, but the unease grew stronger with each passing day. One night, as he was lying in bed, Jonathan heard a faint creaking sound coming from the hallway outside his room. It was the sound of floorboards bending under weight, as if someone was walking slowly, deliberately. His heart began to pound, and he held his breath, listening intently. Footsteps grew closer, stopping right outside his bedroom door. Jonathan stared at the door, his mind racing. Should he get up and check? Or should he stay hidden, pretending to be asleep? Suddenly, the door handle began to turn, ever so slowly. The door creaked open, just a crack, but enough for Jonathan to see a sliver of the hallway beyond. His breath caught in his throat as he saw a shadow pass by the crack in the door. Someone, or something, was standing just outside. Jonathan was paralyzed with fear. He wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't move. The shadow lingered for what felt like an eternity before the door slowly creaked shut again. The next morning, Jonathan found himself unable to shake the terror of the night before. He decided to confront whatever it was that was haunting him. He searched the house thoroughly, checking every room, every closet, every corner, but there was no sign of anyone else. As he sat down to catch his breath, he noticed the box from the other night sitting on the table. The photo was still inside. Something had changed. The man in the photo was no longer standing outside the house. Instead, he was inside, standing in what looked like Jonathan's living room. His expression was even more menacing, and his eyes seemed to follow Jonathan no matter where he stood. Jonathan's blood ran cold. He realized with horror that the man in the photo was getting closer, moving through the house, room by room. What would happen when the man reached his bedroom? Panicked, Jonathan decided to destroy the photo. He grabbed it and threw it into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed it. But even as the photograph burned, the uneasy feeling didn't leave him. If anything, it grew stronger. That night, the footsteps returned, louder and more persistent. The doors in the house creaked open and shut on their own, and Jonathan could hear whispering, soft, indistinct voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Desperation drove Jonathan to search for answers. He began digging into the history of the house, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. After days of research, he discovered something chilling. The house had once belonged to a man named Edward Holloway, who had mysteriously vanished one night, leaving no trace behind. Locals believed that Edward had been cursed, his spirit doomed to wander the house for eternity, unable to leave. Jonathan's fear turned to dread as he realized that the man in the photograph was Edward Holloway. The box, the photo, the note, it was all a warning. Edward's spirit was still in the house, and now it was coming for Jonathan. That night, as the wind howled outside and the house groaned under the weight of the storm, Jonathan prepared for the worst. He locked himself in his bedroom, barricading the door and holding a flashlight in his trembling hands. But it wasn't enough. Footsteps came again, heavier and more deliberate. They stopped outside his door, and Jonathan heard the familiar sound of the handle turning. The door rattled as something tried to force its way in. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Jonathan's flashlight flickered weakly, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. He backed into a corner, his heart pounding in his chest. The door burst open, and the flashlight died. Jonathan was enveloped in darkness, but he could feel a presence in the room with him, cold, malevolent, and hungry. When the neighbors found Jonathan's house the next morning, it was silent and still. The front door was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, the house was untouched, as if no one had been there for years. But Jonathan was gone. No trace of him was ever found, just like Edward Holloway before him. The only clue left behind was the small wooden box, now empty, sitting on the kitchen table. The house eventually sold to another family, unaware of its dark history. And the cycle began again. Late at night, the new occupants would hear soft footsteps in the hall, and sometimes they'd find a small wooden box on the porch, waiting to be opened.